Finally, smooth muscle. So smooth muscle tissue itself can be divided into two types. One is multi-unit and the second is single unit. In multi-unit, fibers contract independently, whereas, sort of as the name implies, in single unit, all the fibers contract together. They contract in a single unit muscle at the same time because they have these gap junctions, just spaces in between the cells that share cytosol. So if some of the cytosol in any of the cells becomes positively charged through an action potential, that charge will travel to nearby cells and all muscle fibers will contract together. So let's look at some examples of that. I really like this photo because it illustrates the multi-unit and the single unit with the associated nerves. So on the left, you have these multi-unit cells, which each have their individual nerves. They can contract independently because each of those nerves, of course, can either be in a resting or in an action potential state. On the right-hand side, you have cells that have gap junctions, these small little yellow junctions here in this cartoon, and that allows coordinated contraction. So if one action potential comes down this neuron, all the associated cells that share cytosolic contents through the gap junction move in a coordinated way. Smooth muscle also don't have this striated type of arrangement. They have a slightly different sort of cell anatomy arrangement. So they have these new structures that are called dense bodies. These dense bodies are kind of like beads that have these threads coming out. These threads are just actin filaments, and again, you still have myosin. So instead of having an individual sarcomere be the contracting unit, the contracting units exist in between these dense bodies. And these dense bodies can be arranged in a number of different ways in any individual smooth muscle cell. If you think about your small intestine, if you take an anatomy, or if you just know a little bit about the shape of the small intestine, it goes back and forth in your abdomen, in your gut, right? So these dense bodies just have a specific arrangement that they can sort of be arranged in a circular, semicircular type of way, and in between each of those dense bodies, individual muscles can contract. So the smooth muscle doesn't have to have a linear type of straight shape or be attached to long bones, which if you think about skeletal muscles, all of them are long tube-like muscles which are attached to bone. In this case, the myosin filaments are more interspersed, and this is the contractile unit. There no longer is a sarcomere, but there is just in between two dense bodies, threads of actin that grab onto myosin, or rather are grabbed by myosin. Unlike skeletal muscles, smooth muscle contractions are prolonged. They're long-lived. They can last hours. They can even last days. And that's because there's a slow sort of ability or cycling of the cross bridges. Cross bridges just means where actin and myosin interact and myosin gets pulled. Myosin pulls actin toward the center. That's a very slow process in smooth muscle. It requires much less energy. So the onset of contraction is slower, but there's an increased maximum force of contraction per gram of smooth muscle. So smooth muscle are actually, in a way, more powerful, can generate more mechanical force than a skeletal muscle can. This is sort of what a smooth muscle looks like when it shortens. It can actually shorten by a larger percentage than skeletal muscle. It's not limited to the bone. The problem with the skeletal muscle is it's really limited in its shortening because it's attached to a bone. Smooth muscle is not attached to a bone. So if it's maximally contracted, it can become much shorter than if it's in its elongated, naturally kind of resting form. Finally, what about differences between smooth and skeletal muscle as far as contraction? Well, you still have actin and myosin, but in this case, instead of having troponin and tropomyosin, you have a different mechanism at play. Just like skeletal muscle, calcium is going to start the party. But unlike skeletal muscle, calcium is not going to bind here to troponin, moving tropomyosin off of actin. That was the case in skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle doesn't have troponin and tropomyosin. Smooth muscle has another protein. This protein is called calmodulin. This calmodulin protein, think of the word cal or calcium, modulate. This calmodulin protein, in the presence of calcium, activates a protein kinase called MLC kinase. A kinase is just an enzyme in a cell that adds a phosphate group, or it phosphorylates. A phosphate group or phosphorylation usually just activates something. So again, calmodulin activates this protein called MLC kinase. And this MLC kinase, or myosin light chain kinase, becomes phosphorylated. MLC here is phosphorylated, and the muscle contracts. For that muscle to relax, this enzyme called a phosphatase has to remove that phosphate group from MLC. So the MLC goes from its phosphorylated state to its dephosphorylated state. Now that MLC is dephosphorylated, the muscle relaxes, meaning myosin lets go of actin. So again, in contraction, you have calcium phosphorylating an MLC protein, and then that protein allowing actin and myosin to interact, i.e. contraction. In the relaxed state, you have a lack of calcium, or you have an active MLCK that has been removed of its phosphate group, so it's been made inactive. You have a dephosphorylation, or an inactivation of the MLC protein, and that causes the muscle to relax. This is also the basal state of the muscle. MLC is dephosphorylated in the basal resting state. Other things that are different about skeletal versus smooth muscle is that these neurotransmitters, we've talked about acetylcholine, we haven't spoken too much about norepinephrine, but these can have excitatory or inhibitory effects depending on the receptors that are part of smooth muscles, and we'll look at this a little bit later when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is not really present. Calcium just comes from the cytoplasm, so even though in this cartoon back here it shows sarcoplasmic reticulum in the smooth muscle, most of the calcium from the smooth muscle comes from outside of the cell, extracellularly into the cytoplasm of the smooth muscle. That's sort of different, whereas the skeletal muscle actually has a very large sarcoplasmic reticulum with tons of calcium. In the smooth muscle also, calcium is pumped back and removed. Again, that's different from being pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum like in the skeletal muscle, but calcium is pumped back, in this case, out of the cell, where it came from, into the extracellular fluid. In the case of the skeletal muscle, it was pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's what terminates contraction in a smooth muscle. And that's it.